Hello, I'm Penny Thornton and I'm talking astrology. On this video, I'm going to be talking about the lunar eclipse in Scorpio, which takes place on the 5th of May, 2023. Now, all eclipses are important. They've been important ever since they were noted thousands of years ago, and they were always looked at and seen to be portents of great events, usually matters of state, the births of kings, the deaths of kings, wars, pestilences, you name it, it got thrown at the eclipse. And we still today, in modern astrology, look at eclipses and recognize they're game changers. They shift. They produce, or they don't produce it, they preside over over shifts, so we may look at that. And sometimes, of course, as you know, if you've read any of my work on earthquakes and lunar eclipses, solar eclipses, you'll see that sometimes there are shifts in the earth when we have a lunar eclipse or around that time. The other thing I want to say about this lunar eclipse, as I've said about other eclipses in the past, even though this eclipse is set to occur on the 5th of May, the timeline of an eclipse is elastic. So we stretch back a few weeks and we go forward a few weeks. And of course, a couple of weeks ago, we had a solar eclipse, which was a mighty solar eclipse because it was angling Pluto. So you can look at these eclipses as bookends, if you like, and I call them a kind of season of eclipses. So that a lot of really, really important events tend to cluster around the time of an eclipse. And as I often say too, the signature of an eclipse will be seen on the major events of the time, and that includes your lives as well. It all depends whether your natal chart or in your natal chart, the eclipse is falling on anything in particular, one of the angles, the ascendant, descendant, midheaven, IC, or whether it's on one of your planets and planets. And obviously this eclipse will have a much more personal and individual meaning for you. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit further on after I've looked at this general picture for this eclipse. This is a penumbral eclipse, which means that the moon, the earth, and the sun are not perfectly aligned. So you don't get a clear kind of picture of the eclipse. Some of it is in shadow, but not all of it. Some of the moon is in shadow, but not all of it. But in my experience, whether it's a total eclipse, whether it's a partial eclipse or a penumbral eclipse, they preside over some pretty important events. And although I am recording this in April, what we're looking at around the time of this eclipse on the 5th of May is the coronation of King Charles III. And that's taking place literally hours after this lunar eclipse. So we can see that the eclipse is definitely playing into the significance of the time. But I want to talk about this as well in the sense of, the coronation is a particularly good example of what an eclipse can preside over. Because if we go back 6 months and we look at the solar eclipse in Scorpio on the 25th of October, 2022, it was about 2 degrees of Scorpio. And that was followed by a lunar eclipse on the 8th of November, which fell around about 16 degrees of Scorpio Taurus. The events of that period, October, November, will play into current events, April and May's events. And we can see that very, very clearly in regard to the coronation, because the eclipses of the 25th of October and the 8th of November, they both presided over the end of the Elizabethan age and the beginning of King Charles's reign, the Carolean reign. And it was in that time period that the coronation date was announced, and also that Camilla would be queen consort. And we got a lot of things of regal importance and significance at that particular time. But also to remind you that events of that time in your personal life will be playing into the events of April and May this year, clustering around the eclipses, think back to see what began or what events were current and how they're now playing in to this period of time. That's going to be an interesting exercise for you to look at in your own lives. But of course, especially if you're a Scorpio or a Taurus and you've got a birthday either at the very beginning of your sign or the sort of middle of your sign, or indeed if you're an Aquarian or a Leo, because these are the signs that are picking up the solar eclipse 2 weeks ago and also this lunar eclipse that's forthcoming. Other events that were significant, interestingly enough, in the October and November of last year, Donald Trump announced his candidacy for the presidency. He was going to run for the presidency in the next election. Liz Truss came and went. She was the very brief Prime Minister of Great Britain. And indeed, at this important October-November time, Putin suffered a series of big defeats. And in humiliation, the Russians left Kherson. So, last but not least, I nearly forgot, of course, there were these big cryptocurrency crashes all in that time period. So we want to look at that little list of events and see how they are playing into this one. And always Taurus Scorpio, the axis of Taurus Scorpio has a financial aspect to it. So there are often great developments in financial circles around, a time of an eclipse on that axis. But of course, we've had a lot of kind of financial wobbles this year. We've seen a lot of banking collapses and general jitters going through financial markets and the banking world. And I suspect that will also occur around the time of this lunar eclipse as well. So when we look at this eclipse and we try to get a kind of general meaning about it, I've already mentioned, the financial aspect of it. I've also mentioned the kind of royal, regal aspect of it all, because we know from October, November, those events were significant, and they're coming up to be significant again in this late April, mid to late May period as well. We've got to remember really what a lunar eclipse is. It's a full moon, except it's eclipse because of the positions of the sun, the moon, and the earth falling on the nodal axis. So we're looking at closure and completion when we look at full moons, so that things get done and dusted. So we can think about this in our personal lives. What are we closing up now? Drawing a line under and saying, okay, that's it. What's next? That's done and dusted. But also simmering issues reach a bubble. So tensions in different parts of the world where you've already got really difficult relations between one country and another, one group and another group, then these tend to erupt around the time of a lunar eclipse because, simmering tensions come to the bubble. And we can also see this possibly in the way that we have eruptions of all sorts when we have a lunar eclipse like this. So it's worth keeping your eye open for all sorts of things that would fit that bill. Anxieties are raised, tensions increased, and just keeping this in mind will help us keep our balance during this time of extremes. Now, it doesn't mean that everything about this period around this lunar eclipse is bad and difficult and awful. We can have some really amazingly good events, but they still cause challenges and create tensions. So if we know that, whether again in our personal lives, we can monitor that situation a little and remember this is how we're going to feel, and then to sort of be able to take a breath and move through it. Because, sometimes the situations that we meet in our lives, which are really, really very stormy, actually pave the way for really good things to come. And the more of that kind of attitude we have to them, the easier the situation is. Another factor with this lunar eclipse is that secrets emerge. So you see things that you haven't known about coming to the surface. Sometimes this amounts to a big scandal erupting, sometimes it's something that happened a very, very long time ago, and we're now beginning to see it and understand it. But we've also got to remember with an eclipse, or the events related to that eclipse, is that what we see isn't necessarily all that we get. This is about shadows, isn't it? The shadow of the earth crossing the moon, if you like. So something is always in shadow at an eclipse, which will emerge later. So not necessarily everything is understood at the time of an eclipse. So I think those are the kind of brief things that I would want to label this kind of eclipse with. But I also want to say a little bit about the way I work when I'm doing these general kind of views of full moons or new moons or particular kind of configurations. And that's really that I always take the sun sign perspective. I look at it from the perspective of the sun, and I also bring the personality into the interpretation as well. So that when you know your sun sign, you'll be able to listen to my forecasts which relate to that sign. That being said, if you know your ascending sign, so you know where, in this case, the eclipse is going to be falling, then you will be able to put the axis of that eclipse into the relevant house. But it will still be important to know the degree of your ascending sign. This particular lunar eclipse is going to be happening at about 15 degrees of Scorpio Taurus. So if your rising sign is, let's say, sort of 23 degrees of something, you may find that it doesn't fall neatly into the house that I'm talking about. But you'll be able to observe it yourself. If you know your natal chart, you'll know where this eclipse is falling. And the reason I'm talking about that this time is that when I did my video on the solar eclipse and I looked at it from the perspective of the 12 signs, the problem with that is that it wasn't really straightforward, the solar eclipse, because the solar eclipse happened at the very, very, very last degree and almost the last minute of Aries. But the Sun-Pluto square, the Sun was in Taurus and Pluto, of course, in Aquarius. So there was a kind of fudging of different signs and therefore different houses. And it did get a little complicated for some of you, and I apologize for that. But that's an unusual kind of development. On this one, we're looking at the middle of the sign of Taurus, Scorpio. And as I'm going to show you in a minute, you'll see all the other things that are incredibly important related to this particular eclipse. In fact, why don't we go there right away and have a look at the horoscope? Now, as you'll see, I've set this lunar eclipse from London, and the reason being that, of course, we know the coronation is taking place in London within hours of this solar eclipse. And incidentally, of course, solar eclipse in Scorpio, King Charles is a Scorpio, and he has a moon in Taurus. So this is a very, very personal and very, very important eclipse for him. And although we look at this being the crowning glory of his life, if you like, and signified by this lunar eclipse, there's a lot of other shadows and tensions and stresses within this particular eclipse, which may have revealed themselves a couple of weeks, 3 weeks before the actual event. And we may already have seen that there have been some really difficult events or challenging events that may have cast their shadow on this particular coronation. Now, if you look at the picture here, you'll see the moon at the 8 o'clock position, 14 of Scorpio, and you'll see at the opposite point in the chart, the sun at 14 degrees of Taurus. What you want to note from this is really the proximity of Uranus, that little telegraph pole, television aerial symbol, which is right next to the sun. The sun is within 3-ish degrees of Uranus, and the sun will conjoin Uranus a couple of days after the coronation. So Uranus is this very, very unpredictable, electric kind of influence. So we can get some of the most amazing developments that come out of thin air that are literally fantastic. And we can also get some very, very unsettling events that kind of pull the rug out from underneath us. So the fact that the sun is so close to Uranus, this eclipse is connecting with Uranus, means that this is a very unstable period of 2023 all round for everybody, for the globe, if you like. And anything and everything may happen around this time. But we should also look at Uranus for providing awakenings. And awakenings can be wonderful things. When we suddenly realize something, we have great insights, great understandings about things. We see things in a whole new light. These are Uranian properties, and we can expect this sort of experience as well. But what I would advise generally everyone looking at this particular pattern is that, nothing is nailed down right now. Anything is possible, and keep your plans loose and keep your attitude very kind of open-ended. It's going to be the best way to get the best out of this particular eclipse and the influences surrounding it. What you may also notice as you look at the shaping of this particular horoscope, you'll see that all the planets, bar the moon, and the moon, of course, isn't a planet, it's a satellite, but in astrology world, or astrology land, we call it a planet. As you'll see, everything is in half the horoscope. It's in one hemisphere. And that's important because it gives us what we call a bowl shaping. And the properties of a bowl shaping, especially if you've got it in a natal chart, and of course there are going to be babies born at this time, means that you soak up the experience of what's going on around you in your life, in your world. You process it and then deliver it out in a new form. So bold people take in experience, but then they recycle it and deliver it out. And when we look at the position of the moon, which I call the spoon to the bowl, if you've got a planet out here solo on its own, is that the moon becomes the vehicle for all that information and experience. So this is we've had this configuration going for many, many moons. We've had bundles, which are much more concentrated energy or of planets, and we've got a bowl which expands it a little bit more because Mars and Venus are now moving away from their tight bundle shaping. And this also makes for a kind of period of time when I suspect a lot is going on, a lot we feel we have no control over. It's happening out there, and we're having to adjust our lives accordingly. And when we think about the principle of that Scorpio Taurus axis having such a lot to do with the material world, finances, and we've had really a very, very difficult time with inflation and interest rate rises. And I think this lunar eclipse really does give us pause for thought, and maybe representing a kind of crisis point, if you like, for things to do with economies and our own management of finances and our material world. And I think we see that really quite clearly emphasized in the chart. So I'm going to come away from the lunar eclipse in its horoscopic form and get down to really talking about what it means sign by sign. And just to remind you again, it's really good to take it from your sun sign, because our sun sign, the sun being the solar force, it is our brand. I often liken our sun sign to our nationality. I mean, if we're British, if we're American, if we're Australian, we're Finnish, whatever we may be, we share our brand, our identity brand, with our nation, and we have some national characteristics. And that's why the sun sign is important, and why we can look at it generally, because all Suntorians will share some of those characteristics, as will wherever your sun sign is. So I would recommend, if you're listening to this and taking it all in sign by sign, you definitely want to look at this lunar eclipse from the perspective of your sun sign, just your general sun sign. And then for extra information and insight, you'll want to take it from your ascendant point and look at where that lunar eclipse is occurring in your natal chart. So you've got two ways to look at this. The moon is not part of this story. Your natal moon is not part of this story. All right, if your natal moon is 15 degrees of Taurus or Scorpio, yes, it will be part of the story. But just generally having a moon in Taurus or a moon in Scorpio isn't significant enough to start looking at the eclipse from that perspective. Stick to the sun and the ascendant, okay? So without more ado, let me go through sign by sign. And I'm going to start, of course, with Taurus. The reason why, because, of course, this eclipse is happening on the Taurus-Scorpio axis. So as we look at your solar chart, we have the sun in the first house, the moon in the seventh house, and this is known as the relationship axis. It's all about relationships. It's all about completion and union, but also it's about separation. One of the important things about eclipses is that the experience of an eclipse to us, what it means for us, is often brought to us by a person. So it's the actions of another person. It's our involvement with another person that gives us the meaning, the experience, what that event, that's the experience of the eclipse. So particularly when we've got the eclipse on the relationship axis, that really looms large as a major theme. So it may be at this time something you already know. You are going to be getting married, or you are ready to move in or upgrade your love affair into something a lot more serious. Or maybe you're going to start a company, or you're going to work with a company and you've got a business partner. So this eclipse is the signature on that new partnership and that new relationship, which is very powerful because it's an eclipse. So we have this idea of endings and conclusions, which can be happy endings. But there are also those factors in a full moon and in a lunar eclipse that bring simmering issues right up to boiling point. So if there are tensions in a relationship, if there are cracks in a relationship, if you've been hanging on, struggling with a relationship, then this eclipse is likely to exacerbate all of that. So you may reach the conclusion that is the time to cut the ties that bind. Important people can come into your life around the time of an eclipse, whether they're there because their influence on you is powerful and you change because of them, or they bring about events that cause enormous change in your life, or it is the nature of your relationship with them, which means whether it's romantic, whether it's business, whatever it is, that's what this eclipse is all about. Now, let's not forget that Uranus is up close and personal to the sun at the moment. It's involved in this eclipse. So the events that link to relationships, endings, union, separation, all those themes I've just given you, they come in surprisingly. You're not expecting them, or there is some dimension to that that is different from the way you expected it. So let's move on now to the next sign. Let's move on to Gemini. For you, the sun is currently in the 12th house of the chart, the area I call the house of secrets and shadows. The moon, of course, is in the opposite sign when it comes to this lunar eclipse. It's in the 6th house. And so I call this axis the axis of service and sacrifice. So this is a pretty important axis because what it will bring into sharp relief is the devotional aspect of your own nature, which brings us into the world of spiritual beliefs and your spiritual code. But it's also about your relationship with others in the sense of the duty you have to others and the purpose that you have in working with others or in the way you interact with other people. There is an aura of duty and sacrifice about this particular eclipse. Now, the sun, of course, is moving through the 12th house, and it's going to be moving through there until it comes into your own sign on and around the 21st of May. So during the time the sun is moving through the 12th house, it's a time of preparation. It's also a time of dissolution. By that, I mean things are being dissolved. You're thinking about things that are no longer of purpose in your life, so you're putting them away, but you're processing events that have happened, situations that are current in your life are being processed and dissolved in order for the new start you'll be making when the sun comes into your own sign. This idea of preparation can be seen on all fronts. You could be preparing for a very big event. You could be preparing for something, fully knowing it. You could be preparing for an exam. There are so many ways we think of preparation. But what we want to do when we're in preparation is get match fit. And that's something else in relationship to this eclipse, which is about health of mind, body, and spirit. So it's time to really focus on those aspects of your existence in preparation for the new start you will be making. It's a good time to get your health in tip-top order. So having your annual checkup, health-wise, your dental checkup, and also paying attention to any aches and pains or anything that you think is a bit of an anomaly. It's time to get it seen to. And this eclipse may actually be the trigger that gets you to do that. A lot of things about a lunar eclipse and a full moon eclipse are about bringing things to the surface. You remember, I've talked about that. What's in shadow is being relieved, is being revealed. And that's an important action that this full moon eclipse has in your life. So it could be a time of tension, and when you're aware of the weaknesses in your system, but it could also be a time of fulfillment when you realize a lot of the sacrifices you made, a lot of the devotional aspects of your nature to other people or what you do have really fulfilled themselves. You can see that in beautiful technicolor, so to speak. If we come to Cancer, we're looking at the sun in the 11th house and the moon in the 5th house. And this is the axis of creativity and collaboration. The slightly greater emphasis is on collaboration because that's where the sun is moving through. And when the sun moves through the 11th house, and remember it takes about a month until the 21st of May. And what happens in this area is that things to do with the group, it's the group mind, it's the collective, it's things that you do with other people, whether in a work sense or a social sense, whatever it may be. The sun's focus is on this area of life. And when we think about it, so much of our time is spent doing things on our own. We have to think about what we're doing and our contribution, and it's very self-focused. The minute we start getting the 11th house brought into our experience, it's all about interacting with other people, the power of the group, as opposed to the power of the self. So these are things to think about as we go through this period that's going to be covering, the time you're watching this video and through to the 21st of May. So the full moon, with the moon in the opposite area of the horoscope, which is all about me, the inner you, all sorts of things related to what you offer out to the world, your offerings, your creative offerings. And so this lunar eclipse could be said to be the axis of gestation. So something that's been gestating is about to be delivered. And we think of all sorts of things that have been gestating or cooking or percolating for a while. They have a time span. And that time span might be 6 months, it might be 9 months, it might be 3 months. But thinking particularly of that October and November period, which I talked about at the beginning of my video here, that may be very illuminating to you, because something that began in the October-November period is at a junction now. That full moon eclipse is bringing it to a junction. So either it's complete, it's done, there is no more to it, or it's the end of that stage, that gestational stage, and you're beginning another one. And I think particularly when we think of love affairs and things that have been incubating like that, this lunar eclipse may be extremely relevant to you in that way, Cass. If we come to Leo, this lunar eclipse falls on the axis of life direction. So we've got the foundations of life, your ancestry, where you come from, your parents, your early childhood, everything you knew that you came into the world with and have grown up from. And the 10th house, remember this is the axis of the 4th and 10th house, is where we greet the world. We go out on the world stage as fully formed individuals with ideas and directions that we want to plow our energies, talents, and interests into. The 10th house has a lot to do with career, but it's also the role in life. So when we think of the roles we have roles of mother, of father, of sister, of brother, of all sorts of things. And yes, we can also be nurses, doctors, writers, teachers, whatever else reflects our role in life. So this lunar eclipse on the axis of life direction brings something into the arena about sort of where do I go from here? It's both an ending and a beginning. So it may be that you've come to the end of a job, or the end of a job is in view. And maybe that means you'll be focusing on a new job, or maybe it means this is it, I'm retiring. So this lunar eclipse has a lot to do with chapters ending, but it could be in the reverse as well because of the axis this is on. And so the lunar eclipse itself, the moon in the 4th house, brings to an end a chapter for family life, for the home you've been living in. But I think it can also bring tensions and issues to the surface, which require exploration. Now, we know the nature of an eclipse is quite intense, so it's not necessarily an easy experience or an easy matter that comes to fullness at this point. It can be quite emotional and difficult, but because of that full moon and the idea that something is coming to the surface, to a tipping point, means that resolution follows. That's actually what's being offered here. Again, let's not forget that Uranus is up close and personal to this eclipse. It's conjunct the sun, opposed to the moon. So there's an element of surprise, something you weren't expecting out of the blue that's going to play into this idea of the end of chapters. If we come now to Virgo, this lunar eclipse falls on the axis of travel and communication. Well, actually, it's a lot more than that. When I think about the 9th house, where the sun is moving through, and the 3rd house, where the moon will be during the course of this lunar eclipse, we're really looking at journeys in mind, body, and spirit. The sun moving through the 9th house is taking you out into the world. It's either looking at different countries and different places, so you may be traveling to different locations, but it can also take you into different worlds. When you study something or you're acquiring knowledge and information, the world opens up for you. So there are many ways to really interpret what's happening when you get planets going through the 9th house and you get a lunar eclipse on the 3rd, 9th axis. It's the completion of a journey, the end of a journey in mind, body, and spirit. That's this eclipse in a nutshell for you. And remember to stretch it out a little bit, although the eclipse itself may be on the 5th of May. Remember, the elastic timeline of an eclipse forward and backwards. Could mean you've already completed that journey, but then this is the signature upon that. And there will be all sorts of awakenings from that, because guess what? The sun is conjunct Uranus and the moon is opposed to Uranus. So that element of surprise, of awakenings, of the unusual, the controversial, that's all in the mix with this lunar eclipse. And yes, you may find that the journey itself is what is so important to your life and your future. Whether that really is a journey on a boat, a plane, or a train, or we could be looking at the journey and the arrival at a destination, or the return home, then this is part of that eclipse experience. And again, remember, as I said to some of the other signs, the idea that the meaning of an eclipse is often brought to you by an individual, by somebody. So it could be your interaction with someone you meet on your journey, or it could be what happens when you get to your destination. Somebody is part of that story of the eclipse for you. But it is a really, really good time to end things. And because the 9th house, where the sun is moving through at the moment, is one of the legal areas of the horoscope, it might be very appropriate to sign a contract, or for a contract to be part of the eclipse story. The end of a contract, the start of a contract. If we move on now to Libra, then this eclipse cuts across the axis of self-worth. It's about values, material values, spiritual values, emotional values. The sun is moving through the 8th house, and the 8th house is a very complicated area. I know a lot of people struggle with it. It's got the label of the house of death and rebirth, and you think, oh, is that death and, rebirth into the spiritual world? Well, of course not. It's a metaphor, isn't it? It's about those things that bring about the death of the old and the birth of the new. And that process goes on a lot when we've got planets moving through the 8th houses. 8th house, remember, death and rebirth, end and beginning. Renewal is another really, really good word for the 8th house experience. But another factor about the 8th house, where the sun is moving through, it is about reciprocity and receivership, another two important words. The 8th house being an extension of the 7th house, which is where we relate to other people. It's about our business and romantic relationships. In the 8th house, it's really what we get from those relationships. And if we think about it, when we enter a relationship with a company, or we enter a relationship with a building society, a bank, a credit card company, or even with a romantic partner, we enter a financial relationship with them as well. This is why this is about reciprocity and receivership. What do you get from your partners in terms of money, or in terms of the value that they bring to your life? Looking again now at the lunar eclipse, the moon in the 2nd house, so values of self-worth, there's something here about a crisis about self-worth. So it's, on the one hand, an opportunity to really examine whether you feel you are getting full value from your relationships, whether they're working relationships, romantic relationships, business relationships, financial relationships. And the crisis that's forming will enable you to make changes and decisions. But we could also look at the idea that there's a financial crunch here. So that actually you are dealing with something that brings a financial matter right to the surface. It's also about an ending. So it could be the end of a financial arrangement, the end of a source of income. It could tie in even with an inheritance or something like that. But we're in the area, if you're comfortable with the idea of receivership, reciprocity, value, self-worth, play around with those themes in your life, and you will see what a powerful effect this lunar eclipse is going to have on that area or those areas of your existence. If we come now to Scorpio, we're back on the relationship axis, because at this time, late April through to 21st of May, the sun is moving through the 7th house. So here we are, relationships in general, other people's impact on your life being more important. And I don't want to say other people are more important in your life at this time, but I think their needs, their activities, it's looking at them. It's walking a mile in their shoes, which is what we should do when the sun is moving through the 7th house. It is a time of partnerships, so we can form partnerships, find new people to partner up with in business or in romance, all those kind of things, where we find someone who we feel is partner material. So that's going on while the sun moves through the 7th house. When we get to the lunar eclipse on the 5th of May, the moon is in your sign. It's right opposite that sun in the 7th. So you are right in the middle of all of this. And the moon in your own house, in your own sign, so to speak, empowers you always. And I think I may have mentioned this for Taurus, where I say someone brings you the message of the eclipse. It's a person. Well, because the moon is in Scorpio, you are the messenger of this eclipse. It's what you have to bring to a relationship. It's what you bring to others in the way of all sorts of things, whether you are the person behind an ending or a beginning, whether you are ready to unite with someone or ready to say, I think we're done. Remember, the power is in your hands. You are the messenger of this eclipse. But let's not forget the other very, very important factor here, and that's Uranus. Uranus is up close and personal to the sun. It's opposing the moon at this particular lunar eclipse. So events not in your control, in the control of other people, are forging this step in you to make or break a relationship, or to reach a point where you are ready to sign up to something or ready to sign off on something. So these are the influences that you're playing with around this time, Scorpio. But yes, very important for you to go back to that late October, November period, the events that happened at that time, because they will be playing into this time as well. You might find a direct link. You know, something began, now it's finished. Something's been in preparation for all these months, it's ready to be delivered. You can look at those themes and find a connection with them. We come on to Sagittarius. Now, the sun and moon for you are on the axis of what I call service and sacrifice. Now, the sun is moving through the 6th house, the area of service. And in many ways, this throws up during the course the sun is moving, the time the sun is moving through here. What is your duty to other people? What duty and responsibility do you have to other people? So we put the lunar eclipse in with this mix, and it's a bit of a crisis of your duty to yourself and your duty to other people. And that needs to be thought about, because in one way or another, those will be issues around this time. I talk about the 6th house a lot in the sense of we find our purpose in the 6th house. And often our true purpose in life is understood or experienced when we feel we've been of use, that something we've done has helped others or has been of use to others. So while the sun is moving through the 6th house, we often discover aspects of all of that in, events that just happen out of the blue, or we consciously embrace and ask ourselves that question about what role do we play in others' lives in the sense of the service we offer them, the duty and the responsibility we have to them. But this house is also about health. And during the time the sun is moving through the 6th house, we need to have health checkups, dental checkups, get those aches and pains sorted that have been bothering us, and we're too busy to get them sorted. So the full moon eclipse may really highlight what we need to check out. It may be that point where you have a bit of burnout, you've done too much, you're exhausted, or it could be something you've been putting up with, or something that you've been worrying about, but not dealing with. Wham, that lunar eclipse comes up, and sure enough, you've got to pay attention to it. This is also about the workspace as well, not necessarily the work you do for a living, but where you work. So that can include fellow workers, the actual space itself. And so the idea of a lunar eclipse here could mean that's at an end. Maybe the workplace is moving, or maybe there's a lot of movement within your fellow workers. So it's going to amount to an end of a particular phase where you were used to doing this with those people in that place, and now it's all very different. So there are quite a lot of things to play around with here. But again, useful to look back on the October-November period to get illumination as to how events may be connected. Because with Uranus being in the mix, things happen suddenly, out of nowhere. And you sort of think, what? Where did that happen? But you'll be able to trace it back. You'll be able to look back at that period of time, October, November, and connect the dots. That could prove enormously helpful. So if we come now to Capricorn, the sun is currently moving through the 5th house, and at the time of the eclipse, the moon will be in the 11th house. So we're looking at this axis of collaboration and creativity. I'll come on to that in a second. I want to talk a little bit about the sun's passage through the 5th house. This 5th house is all about the self. It's also about the inner child in you. And that's why we get a lot of things to do with the 5th house that are to do with creative pleasures, to do with things that make us feel on fire, really. And affairs of the heart can make us feel on fire. Doing sport can make us feel on fire. So this 5th house is all about generating that sense of excitement and pleasure and things that pleasure the senses and give us a feeling of being fulfilled. That's 5th house matters. It's about creativity, but it's also about procreativity. So we find, becoming pregnant here, becoming a parent here. We find aspects of our children here. We learn about them from what we've got in the 5th house. So during the time the sun is in the 5th house, all these things become more important in our lives. And I think when we get this lunar eclipse, so the moon is in the 11th house of collaboration, other people, your interaction with others, you working with others, the team spirit, also things of a humanitarian nature, that's all 11th house stuff. Those things come to be in opposition to your needs and your likings for pleasure or your experiences. So on the one hand, we might get tensions in a collaborative endeavor. And maybe those tensions mean it's the end of the endeavor, it can go no more. Or maybe it means it's time to notice where the cracks are so that new things can be born out of the original endeavor. It may also be a crisis between the little me, the one we have most access to, and the big me, the higher self versus the smaller self. So in truth, this lunar eclipse is urging you to look at the higher, or take the higher path. Look at the higher dimension of yourself and what your higher self would do in the situation you find yourself. Go for the higher path. And that might put into sharp perspective issues relating to the things that you find enjoyable, pleasurable. Maybe there is a need to look at that bigger picture. And that's what that eclipse is urging you to do. And it may be a bit of a crisis in a love affair, maybe the end of a love affair for some Capricorns, or it may be the end of a stage in a love affair so that you're going to move forward. And again, this idea of 6 months ago, late October into November, the events of that time playing into this time could be really, really illuminating. You could really be able to connect the dots between the events of last year and this year. So if we move now on to Aquarius, Aquarius, for you, this lunar eclipse is on the axis of life direction. And it's a very important axis because the fourth house part of it, the IC, the Imum Coli, is the point of our birth, if you like. This is the family we've come into. This is where we were born. These are our early days, our childhood experience, the family that we are with, and our relationships with the family. And everything grows from there, doesn't it? When you think about your childhood and your upbringing, and you think how much your parents influence the choices you are going to make as an adult, of the career that you are going to go into, whether your experience with your family and your parents was rather negative, and so it formed your idea, you know what, I'm not going to follow that direction, I'm doing something completely different. Or whether you did follow what you had been sort of not educated to be, but programmed to be in a way, from your upbringing and with your family, went on to grow in the direction that they had enabled you to grow. So we look at the 10th house really for things to do with career, with your role in life, and your role in life, of course, isn't necessarily given to you by your career. It's other things in life, you know, you're a brother, you're a sister, you're a parent, you know, all those kind of roles that we take. But yes, it can have to do with a career. So although the sun's movement through the fourth house, it's what's been going on since the end of April and will continue until the 21st of May, although the focus is really on home and family, on your origins, on your ancestry, you may discover things about your forebears. You may be in the process of doing things on the home front. Maybe you're thinking of moving, or you're renovating, or you've got new family coming in, whether by birth or marriage, so that you know full well that this time is fully focused on those kind of things. So bring the lunar eclipse into it, and we could see the end of a chapter for family life. Maybe somebody is moving on, maybe some, you know, a child going off to university or something like that. So you've got the idea of changes within the family home, or you're knocking walls down and building a conservatory. So we're seeing, you know, a lot of activity here that marks the end of the way the house or the home looked. Or we could be looking at a home move, so that you're actually moving from where you've been. This is also the parental axis. So the events around the time of the eclipse could have to do with your family, your parents, whether something of great interest and import is happening to them, so you're brought into that, or whether you have things going on, and it depends on your own circumstances, but it may be that a parent really requires your help now, and that's what's marking the end of a chapter, because something needs to be done. Same really with work. Because of the axis being life direction, there could be a situation where there are job changes in view, maybe the end of a job, the end of a commitment, or the idea of something you already know about, but you know full well you're going to be doing a new job. So it's just the end of the job that you've been in for a while. But because Uranus is involved, we get the idea that there's something unexpected here, so that it's an unexpected event that leads to the end of a chapter. If we come now to Pisces, the sun is currently moving through the third house of your solar chart, and it will continue to do so until the 21st of May. So the lunar eclipse falls in the 9th house. So you've got the moon in the 9th house, you've got the sun in the 3rd house. So this is the axis of communication and travel, but more importantly, it's about journeys. So it's journeys in mind, body, and spirit. So while the time, or during the time the sun is moving in through the 3rd house, may be a period when you're making a lot of journeys, whether in terms of miles or whether in terms of mind, body, and spirit. So journeys are important. The journeys themselves are important. It's also important when you reach the end of a journey, what the result is. So for some Pisceans, this is all about exam taking and the end of a course and something that you've been working on. And now it's done, you know, you've taken that exam or you've done the course. What it's going to lead to may not come immediately on the eclipse. It would be nice if it did, if something, you know, could neatly end on this eclipse and give you everything about the journey you've been on so that you know exactly what it's all about and you've got a result, or whether it just means you've done this part of the journey, the end of that is done, and the results will come through a little further down the line, maybe in 3 months' time, maybe in 6 months' time. And of course, we can go backwards in time as well, Pisces, to the October-November period of last year and see if something began there, especially something that you would say has been a bit of a journey, because it's at an end. There is closure and completion here. Also, the sense that that's finished now and it's time to move on. And that doesn't always feel like a great thing. It can feel sad to be ending something. Now, because of the kind of educational and contractual and legal aspect of this third, ninth axis, and remember the eclipse is in the ninth house, the moon is in the ninth house, the sun in the third, it has a lot to do with the signing of legal documents. So it may have, you know, you may be signing a contract, so you're beginning something following this lunar eclipse, or it may mean that a contract is done. You fulfill the terms of that contract, but Uranus is involved. So it may be something you weren't expecting, you weren't anticipating. And if we just look at legal matters generally, it may be that something surprising comes up. And I would certainly recommend, Pisces, if you are driving around the time of this lunar eclipse, don't speed, don't go through a red light, because I promise you, you will be punished. I don't want to make that sound too harsh, but I've done it enough to know one of those envelopes comes through and you've been flashed. Some camera has caught you. So be careful with your movements on this lunar eclipse. There's nothing to say that there won't be an event that closes something for you and you feel deliriously happy about that. You know, it's done, it's dusted, hooray, I've achieved it, I've got it, I've done this, made this great effort to learn something, to get somewhere, to go somewhere, and here I am. That's fantastic. But it can also be that sense that, you know, you have made the effort, you have walked the walk, but actually it hasn't resulted in exactly what you wanted. But you know what? There's always another journey. And I think when you think of your life in terms of journeys, how many journeys have you made? Both in the real world of miles and those you've made in experience and in knowledge and in emotions. Another journey awaits you. And that's really your focus. If something ends and you would really rather wish it hadn't ended. And so I think finally I come to my last sign, which is Aries. And of course, normally Aries, you begin the zodiac, so you're used to really sort of getting your interpretation first. But here you are, you're the last of my 12. The eclipse for you is in the second house, or rather the sun is moving through the second house, the moon will be in the 8th house. And this is the axis of self-worth and values. It's a really, really important part of the horoscope. Because when we think about who we are, so much of that is reflected in how other people treat us, how they value us. And that value can come in the sense of how much they pay us for what we do, but also how they value us for the person we are. So this lunar eclipse for you may have a lot to do with suddenly realizing either you are full of value to someone and you're feeling that with the fullness of your heart and mind and feeling truly valued. It's a peak moment. Or quite the reverse. And instead you feel, I've done all this, I am this, and I'm not being valued. I'm not being paid enough. I'm not being treated like the person I know I am. And of course, that can have an extension into a romantic relationship or a relationship like marriage, but it could also have an extension to a relationship with a credit card company, a mortgage company, a bank, a partner even with whom you share financial and material responsibilities. This is a kind of crisis full moon about what you do versus what they do. And if they are to be found wanting, that needs to be addressed. A balance needs to be found. It could also coincide with a bit of a financial crisis. And I mean, with the way the cost of living is, the inflation, interest rates, I don't think there's a person who hasn't felt some kind of squeeze. And because everything is changing so fast, I think, and our way of life is changing, and how we spend money and what we spend money on, it's all changing, that it's easy to get caught up in old habits versus the new ones we need to acquire. So for some Arians, this is definitely a time to get finances in balance. And this whole second eighth axis might have to do with breaking agreements. It's the end of an agreement. It may even mean that really a commitment can't be supported anymore. So that commitment has to be dropped. This is also the axis of receivership, so that we get things that we receive from others, which can mean inheritances and settlements. So this full moon could indicate an inheritance or a settlement, or it could indicate closure and completion of some kind of financial transaction, and particularly things to do with property, because certainly in England, when we close and complete on a property, it's ours. So closure and completion may have a very literal translation if you're an Arian. But certainly just in general Aries, have a think back. Have a think back to what you were doing in October and November, perhaps the endeavors you began there, the actions you took financially, or the discussions you had and the agreements you formed with others, because they're up for review on this lunar eclipse. And they might come up for review in a very unexpected way. And why? Because Uranus is close to the sun, it's opposing the moon. So there is an element of surprise here. The thing is that really why we get so bent out of shape with finances sometimes is that we take it personally. We think it's a reflection of our value. And I think if this for you is going to be a financial crisis, then you need to separate out who you are as a person and your value as a person and what's a financial matter. The same with negotiating a deal for yourself. Don't take it personally. Have the ability to know your value and get a good deal based on that commitment to your own value. Don't let personal emotions get into the middle of it. So I think I've gone all the way through the zodiac, all 12 signs. And as you can see, the whole dynamic here with this particular lunar eclipse is its relationship with not only the recent solar eclipse, but also the ones that go back to October and November of last year. And we can see really that in many cases, this full moon is fulfillment. This is the fulfillment of a promise. It's the fulfillment of a journey. But it brings with it its own stresses and strains. I mean, I can't emphasize enough that even when we have absolutely fantastic experiences in our lives, it can place pressure upon us. And, that's why eclipses, I always say, will bring stresses and strains simply because of the nature of that pull between the sun and the moon, if you like, the opposition with the earth in the middle of it. And so to my summing up. Now, I think also in light of the fact that we're talking about an eclipse on this video, is that eclipses are often fateful. We have fateful developments occur, or seemingly fateful developments occur on and around the time of an eclipse. And when something fateful happens to us, it's almost as though we had no control of that event. That just happened. And when we think of that, it's almost like we can abdicate responsibility for what happened because it wasn't of our making. We didn't know it was going to happen. And here it is. Now, what do we do? So I'm going to come to that shortly. But what I also want to say about the idea of eclipses, and I know a lot of people get very anxious about eclipses. And I think with a degree of, we should be aware of eclipses, and not with trepidation, but I think I've described this once before as if you were going to climb the Himalayas, climb Everest. You would be excited about the prospect before you, anticipating it with excitement, but you would also have a level of fear because it is the unknown. And I think that's the kind of metaphor I'd like for you to look at this eclipse in your life and in general, what it will bring. Have anticipation for what great things might come about, but also be prepared, because when things change or things happen that are quite big for us, that can send a sort of element of scariness into our being. But don't be scared. Be prepared. That's a much better way of looking at it. And so here again, I come to this idea of what happens at an eclipse may appear to be something out of our control. But you know what? We do have control. That event has happened. But where we go from there, the choice that we make is our choice. It's in our control. And this is why I talk so much about your outlook and how you look at a situation from different perspectives. Because when you look at a situation from different perspectives, you get a different outlook on it. And what else do you get? You get a different outcome. So whatever happens to you, whatever your sign around this time, whether you are absolutely over the moon about developments, or whether you really feel as though the rug has been ripped from right underneath you, remember you have choices to make thereafter, and everything rests on those choices. And in that way, you have control. So thank you for watching. I hope you found it enlightening, and please subscribe if you haven't subscribed yet. And because it's so important, as I often say, let's spread good astrology. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you next time, next video. Bye for now.